So you build an Angular application. Of course, the goal is not to keep that application on your system forever. Instead, you typically want to deploy it at some point. You want to host it on some web server that can be visited by users from all over the world so that users from all over the world can use your application. That's typically the goal, and that's therefore what we'll focus on in this section. For that, we'll explore different ways of building your Angular application for deployment. SPA, SSR, and SSG, and I'll explain what these different terms mean, what these different options are about, and when you might want to use which of these options. And of course, I'll then also walk you through the process of building your application, and I'll also walk you through an example deployment process for these different options. So, how does deployment of an Angular app work? Well, in the end, it's a multi-step process, you could say. And the first step, of course, is that you develop and test your application. Now, that's what we did throughout this course. We built various Angular applications and used various Angular features. And of course, we always also tested those applications in the browser with help of that locally running development server that can be started by running npm start or ngserve. And that's a development server, a web server, that serves this Angular application you're building from your locally running machine, so from your laptop or computer. And therefore, only you can visit this website by default. No one else can, unless you open up your system to outside visitors, of course. But even if you did, this development server, which is started with npm start and therefore ngserve under the hood, is actually not suited to host your production ready Angular application because in development mode, this code that's being served is not optimized. It's not optimized for size, so it's too big, and it contains some extra logging and error messages or error details if errors occur, which you also might not want to share with the entire world. And therefore, this development server, as its name suggests, is great for development but not for deployment. So therefore, we finished this first step, but now we must prepare this application for deployment. And that means that we need to build it. We must tell Angular, or the Angular CLI to be precise, that we now want to compile and optimize our code for deployment. When running npm start, we actually also tell the Angular CLI to compile our code, because this development server in the end serves the compiled code, but it's not optimized yet. So now we need compilation and optimization. And that can be done by running ng-build or npm run build, which will trigger ng-build under the hood, as you can tell. And what this will do is, just as during development, it will compile the TypeScript code to JavaScript, since TypeScript doesn't run in the browser, but it will now also optimize the code. It will shrink it, make it as small as possible, and overall try to produce an optimized bundle size. And once this process finished, you should therefore find a dist folder in your project folder. And this dist folder should then contain a subfolder that carries your project name. In my case, simply routing. That's how I named my project when I created it. And that routing folder then contains the folders and files that you would deploy. And by default, that folder therefore should contain a browser folder. Now, if you're creating a new Angular project and you're building that, you might actually also have more folders in there, a server folder, for example. But this project here on which we worked throughout this course should only have that browser folder. And that folder contains the files and folders you would now put on some web host so that these files are exposed to the World Wide Web. And then users could go ahead and send requests to that web host and visit your Angular-driven website, therefore. That's in a nutshell how you can build your application for deployment and how you could then deploy it. Though I'll show you a practical example in a couple of minutes. But first, let's understand which kind of build process we started here and which kind of application we built here. Because, as I mentioned before, there seem to be multiple build options when building an Angular project. So which one did we use here? In this example application here, where I ran npm run build without running anything else before, we built this application as a so-called single page application. So that's the first option we have when it comes to building Angular applications. We can build them as single-page applications, which in the end means that we build a client-side only web application. Because the idea behind single-page applications is that we have a single HTML file that will be put on some web host in the end. And it's that file that will be requested by website visitors and that will be loaded. And that file then will load all the JavaScript code that makes up our application. And that JavaScript code will then take over in the browsers of our website visitors. And it's that JavaScript code that will then render the UI of our Angular application. That's what client-side only means here. All the UI rendering happens on the client side by that JavaScript code that is being served by the web host to the website visitors. So all this compiled and optimized application code executes in the browsers of our website visitors, and therefore we don't need any dynamic web server. We don't need a web server that would be able to execute code on it. We don't need to run any Node.js or PHP or any other code on that server. Instead, we just need a static host that's able to serve the single HTML file and all the other assets, like all the JavaScript files we have, to the website visitors. So that's the most basic way of building an Angular application, and sometimes it might be just what you want. Sometimes you just might want to build such a single-page application. But this approach can have disadvantages. For example, since the entire UI is in the end rendered in the browsers of the visitors, the initially loaded page is pretty empty. And if rendering takes a while for some reason, because the browser is slow or anything like that, users might initially see pretty empty websites or at least some missing content. That's not necessarily a problem, but it is something that could happen. In addition, search engine optimization can be a problem because search engine crawlers will likely see an empty site, because they are not waiting for the client-side JavaScript code to render all the content. At least they're not guaranteed to wait. So since this initial HTML file here is pretty empty, as you can see, it only has a couple of style tags and script tags, but no actual content, just this placeholder. Since that's the case, we could run into those disadvantages here. But there also are applications where this might not matter, because search engines might not matter, because it's some internal application or an application that requires authentication anyways. And in such cases, building your Angular apps as single-page applications can be a good idea.